Daily Dose Biographies presents The American Presidents. Lyndon Baines Johnson. Born in 1908 Central Texas, Lyndon Baines Johnson graduated from Southwest State Teachers College while paying for his education by teaching disadvantaged Mexican-American students in South Texas, providing young Johnson with a first-hand taste of poverty and discrimination that would later bear fruit for a nation's disadvantaged poor. Moving to Washington, D.C. as a congressional secretary for Texas Representative Richard Kleberg, Johnson met and married Claudia Alta Lady Bird Taylor, who would later become a critical part of Johnson's political success. His political career took off in earnest in 1937, when he was elected to the House of Representatives as a Democrat, becoming the first member of Congress to volunteer into the military when the United States entered World War II in 1941, serving as a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy until all members of Congress were recalled to Washington in the summer of 1942. Elected to the U.S. Senate in 1948 by a narrow margin of just 87 votes, Johnson became a driving force in Congress with his knack for pushing through key pieces of legislation, serving first as the minority leader of the Senate, followed by Senate Majority Leader when Democrats took control of Congress in 1955. Despite bad blood between Johnson and the Kennedys, in 1960, John F. Kennedy asked Johnson to be his running mate for his successful bid for the White House, only to be sworn in as president following JFK's assassination on November 22, 1963, an event which gutted a nation to its core. Johnson quickly declared a war on poverty in America, pushing Congress to pass legislation addressing illiteracy, unemployment, and racial discrimination, winning a second term by more than 15 million votes over Republican candidate Barry Goldwater. Johnson launched his Great Society campaign, which created Medicare and Medicaid and federal health insurance for the elderly and the poor, at the same time combating ongoing Jim Crow racial prejudice by signing the historic Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. A firm believer in the now discredited domino theory regarding the spread of communism, Johnson's escalation of the Vietnam War made him widely unpopular with the American voting public, leading to his decision not to run for re-election in the presidential season of 1968. He retired to his ranch in Texas to write his memoir and to establish his presidential library, passing away from a heart attack on January 22, 1973, making the life and politics of Lyndon Baines Johnson a mixed bag of social advances on the home front amidst a deepening war in Southeast Asia. The Great Society of Lyndon Baines Johnson. To look back before the legislative reforms of LBJ's Great Society movement of the 1960s, American life before his directives was a very different place. He saw racial discrimination and poverty as moral issues, not just political talking points, to be debated but not acted upon.
For in your time, we have the opportunity to move not only toward the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the Great Society. The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we're totally committed in our time.
The Great Society was a cluster of progressive programs undertaken by the President and Congress, which generated great hope among the downtrodden and the disillusioned. It was quixotic and Arthurian, this idea of might for right, inspiring programs for social justice that still resonate to this day. The war on poverty was part of an idea that you had not a hand out but a hand up. In the 1960s, it was hardscrabble for a lot of Americans, and what the war on poverty meant for these people was jobs, bringing the less affluent into the mainstream of society. When Lyndon Johnson became president, the poverty rate teetered at a staggering 22%, compared to 9.2% today. By the time he left office 5 years later, the poverty rate was less than 13%, which constituted the greatest one-time reduction in the history of the United States. Johnson and civil rights groups managed to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which comprised the first major civil rights legislation since 1875. The act said that public accommodations have to be available to everyone without discrimination on the basis of race, and with one fell swoop, Johnson's Great Society movement wiped out all the whites-only signs in the segregated South. Perhaps the greatest benefit of Johnson's Great Society was Medicare, for before its time, people who reached the age of 65 had no guaranteed health insurance, while today, after LBJ and Congress passed the Medicare Act, in 2021, some 63 million senior Americans are enrolled in Medicare. While most presidents are happy to have one or two pieces of significant legislation attached to their legacy, Johnson pushed through an uncanny amount of impactful laws, which altered the face and very fabric of the nation up to this day.
I believe, at least it will be said, that we tried.
The Watergate Scandal. In 1972, when Richard Milhous Nixon began campaigning for a second term in office, Americans were politically divided over the Vietnam War, leading Nixon's advisors to employ aggressive and quite illegal campaigning techniques, which saw members of Nixon's Committee to Re-elect the President, known derisively as CREEP, to break into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C., bugging phone lines and copying top-secret documents in an effort to gain an upper hand on their political rivals. When the wiretaps began to fail, however, on June 17th of that same year, 5 burglars were caught red-handed as they prepared for a second break-in, leading detectives to find evidence on the men, including a phone number to an office in the White House.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
Over the next 2 years, the truth would be revealed through the efforts of a Senate investigating committee led by trial judge John Sirica and an independent special prosecutor named Archibald Cox, along with 2 investigative reporters from the Washington Post named Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Aided by an anonymous whistleblower codenamed Deep Throat, later revealed in 2005 to be Mark Felt, a former associate director at the FBI, Woodward and Bernstein exposed hush money payments to 7 burglars linked directly to the White House, as well as Nixon's push to have the CIA impede investigative efforts by the FBI. When White House counsel John Dean testified before the Senate's investigative committee about Nixon's insistence on taping all conversations to and from the Oval Office, lawmakers began a full-court press demanding that Nixon hand over all tapes in question. In what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, when Cox refused to back down on his demands, on October 20th, 1973, Nixon ordered his firing, which in turn led several Justice Department officials to resign in protest. Matters worsened in March the following year, when a special grand jury indicted 7 former aides to the president, followed by a July order by the Supreme Court demanding that Nixon hand over all his tapes. And when Nixon dragged his feet on the matter, the House Judiciary Committee voted to impeach the president on charges of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, as well as criminal violations to the Constitution. Cornered and out of options, Nixon released the tapes on August 5, 1974, which exposed irrefutable evidence of his complicity. 3 days later, Nixon would become the first sitting American president to resign from office.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
A day later, Nixon would leave Washington for his adopted city of San Clemente, California, living quietly and largely out of the public's eye until his death on April 22, 1994, making the Watergate Scandal, a Shakespearean tragedy, come to life. The resignation of Richard Milhous Nixon. Born into a poor family in Southern California, Richard Nixon would go on to graduate from Duke University School of Law, followed by a succession of political offices, including congressman and later senator from California, followed by 8 years as vice president under President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Elected into office as the 37th president in 1969, Nixon's 5-year presidency saw the conclusion of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, détente with the Soviet Union and China, and the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as presiding over the Apollo 11 moon landing. During his second term in office, Nixon's presidency would disintegrate under the Watergate Scandal, which stemmed from the Nixon administration's repeated attempts to cover up its involvement in the failed break-in of the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. After the 5 break-in perpetrators were arrested, 2 reporters from the Washington Post and the U.S. Justice Department connected the cash found on the men at the time of the break-in to Nixon's re-election campaign committee, a clear violation of campaign funding law. During his resultant impeachment hearings in the House of Representatives, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Nixon was mandated to release his Oval Office tapes to government investigators, which would later reveal Nixon's direct attempts to cover up activities that took place after the Watergate break-in, while attempting to use federal officials to derail the investigation against him. On August 9, 1974, in the face of almost certain impeachment and removal from office, Richard Nixon became the only sitting president to resign from office.
We leave proud of the people who have stood by us and worked for us and served this country. We want you to be proud of what you've done. We want you to continue to serve in government if that is your wish. Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you. But those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
Just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
Gerald Ford. Born in 1913 Omaha, Nebraska, Gerald Ford became a standout football player during his high school years in Grand Rapids, Michigan, attending the University of Michigan on an athletic scholarship that earned him a degree in economics, followed by a law degree from Yale University. After serving aboard an aircraft carrier in World War II, Ford married his wife Betty in 1948 before winning a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he served with distinction for 25 years, including 8 years as House Minority Leader from 1965 to 1973. In 1972, as pressure began to mount on President Richard Nixon during the Watergate scandal, Vice President Spiro Agnew stepped down due to unrelated charges of tax evasion and accepting bribes. prompting Nixon to invoke his power under the 25th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, appointing Ford as his new vice president. When Nixon chose to resign from office rather than face an impeachment trial, on August 9, 1974, Gerald Ford became the first unelected president in American history, declaring in his inaugural address that our long national nightmare is over and that the Constitution works because our great republic is a government of laws and not men. During his 2 years as president, Ford oversaw the fall of Saigon when he was unable to convince a Democrat-majority Congress to approve further military aid. He also oversaw a domestic energy crisis and a weak economy marred by runaway inflation and high unemployment, while his controversial pardon of Nixon left many Americans believing that Ford had reached the Oval Office under a prearranged deal. In 1976, Ford lost a close election to Democrat Jimmy Carter, and although he stated that he had planned to retire from Congress that same year anyway, he also said that he was pleased to help the American people emerge from the shadow of Watergate with a renewed sense of trust in democratically elected officials. Ford remained active in retirement, sitting on a multitude of major corporate boards while giving speeches and staying actively engaged in his passions for golf and downhill skiing. Known for his clumsiness, in truth, Ford was one of the most accomplished athletes of any American president, having won 2 back-to-back National Football Championships in 1932 and 1933 as a gridiron standout during his student years at Michigan. Awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1999, America's highest civilian honor, he passed away at the age of 93 the day after Christmas 2006, the oldest ex-president at the time of his death, making Gerald Ford's presidency the 5th shortest in American history, but also one of integrity, compassion, and national healing. Jimmy Carter. Born in 1924 Plains, Georgia, Jimmy Carter served as a submariner in the U.S. Navy after graduating from the Naval Academy, resigning his commission to run the family peanut farm after his father passed away in 1953. Becoming a vocal opponent of racial segregation during the Civil Rights Movement, Carter's activism won him a seat in the Georgia State Senate from 1963 to 1967, followed by his ascension to Georgia governor from 1970 to 1975. A year later, the politically unknown outsider narrowly defeated incumbent President Gerald Ford to become the nation's 39th President of the United States. Following his inauguration in January of 1977, Carter's presidency would see the creation of the Departments of Energy and Education, a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel known as the Camp David Accords, the handover of the Panama Canal to Panamanian control, and the SALT II Strategic Arms Limitations talks. On the downside, however, his single-term presidency became overwhelmed by high inflation, high unemployment, and tepid economic growth. Other overshadowing events included the 1979 energy crisis, the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident, and the Iran hostage crisis of 1979, not to mention geopolitical challenges such as the Nicaraguan Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, further escalating the Cold War when Carter ended détente by imposing a grain embargo against the Soviets. Carter's gloomy yet honest outlook was rejected by voters in the landslide presidential election of 1980, which propelled Ronald Reagan's telegenic optimism into office in January of 1981. In the decades following his exit from public service, Carter founded the Carter Center to promote and expand human rights, which won him the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. Authoring over 30 books ranging from political memoirs to poetry, Carter has traveled extensively to oversee peace negotiations and election monitoring around the world, contributing greatly to the advance of disease prevention and eradication in developing countries, while his charitable works have made him the face of Habitat for Humanity for over 30 years. Leading with steadiness, courage, and idealism while in office, Jimmy Carter and his predecessor, Gerald Ford, have been credited with restoring faith in the American presidency after the corrupt years of Richard Nixon, making Jimmy Carter a national treasure and role model for humanitarians everywhere. Ronald Reagan. Born on February 6, 1911 in Tampico, Illinois, Ronald Reagan grew up to attend high school in nearby Dixon before working his way through Eureka College. At Eureka, he studied economics and sociology, played on the football team, and honed his acting skills in school productions. Upon graduation, he became a radio sports announcer, followed by a screen test in 1937 that won him a contract in Hollywood, leading to a 2 decades-long acting career that spanned 53 films.
Anyway, that isn't what I came over to talk about.
That's strange. I thought Gabe's welfare was your only reason for coming here.
I'm getting tired of telling you you're beautiful.
But I'm not getting tired of hearing it.
That's the marvelous thing about you. You're the only person in the world who likes my dialogue.
As president of the Screen Actors Guild, Reagan became embroiled in disputes over the issue of communism in the film industry during the McCarthy era, which helped to shift his political views from liberal to conservative. He toured the country as a television host, becoming a spokesman for conservatism. In 1966, he was elected governor of California by a margin of 1 million votes, only to be re-elected in 1970 by another landslide margin. Ronald Reagan won the Republican presidential nomination in 1980 and chose as his running mate former Texas Congressman and United Nations Ambassador George Bush. Fearful over runaway inflation and the year-long Iran hostage crisis, voters went in big for Reagan, who won 489 electoral votes to Jimmy Carter's 49. Assuming office on January 20th, 1981, only 69 days into his first term, he was shot by a would-be assassin. While he recovered quickly from his injuries, his grace and wit during the dangerous incident caused his popularity to soar, propelling him to a second-term victory over Democratic challengers Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro.
By its very existence and character, Berlin remains the most compelling argument for an open world. We're reminded of the many traditions of openness and democracy that have marked the history of this city. Missed me.
Reagan's 2 terms as president oversaw the return of prosperity at home, as well as resolute foreign policy objectives achieved through his Peace Through Strength initiative abroad. From his first marriage to actress Jane Wyman, he had 2 children, Maureen and Michael, while in 1952 he married screen actress Nancy Davis, raising 2 more children, Patricia Ann and Ronald Prescott. Reagan was the oldest first-term U.S. president in history during his time, a distinction he held until 2017, when Donald Trump was inaugurated at age 70. Reagan passed away on June 5, 2004, after struggling for years with Alzheimer's disease. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. After years of economic decline and a rising awareness by average Joe Russians that the Soviet political elites ate caviar in their dakas, while average Joe stood hungry in food lines, the Soviet Union's ironclad grip over her citizens began to crumble by the late 1980s. Fully aware of the failing state of the Soviet economy, in 1985, General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev began to usher in reforms that would move his nation from strict Marxist-Leninist communism to social democracy. sensing change in the Soviets' core ideology after 40 years of budget-draining Cold War, U.S. President Ronald Reagan called out Gorbachev during a 1987 speech near the Berlin Wall that divided communist East Berlin from democratic West Berlin.
Behind me stands a wall that encircles the free sectors of this city, part of a vast system of barriers that divides the entire continent of Europe. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
2 years later, on the 9th of November 1987, East German politician Günther Schabowski inadvertently triggered the fall of the Berlin Wall when at a live press conference he read a draft bill just passed by the East German government which eased restrictions on the rights of citizens to immigrate to the West. When asked by reporters when these more lenient measures would take effect, Schabowski answered immediately. Known by Germans as Der Mauer, when the news broke, people amassed on both sides of the Berlin Wall, celebrating the end of their divided city for the first time in 26 years. Early breach attempts to the wall met with only mild resistance from border guards, which ushered in a full reunion as people freely crossed through Checkpoint Charlie. The following morning, after Berliners had chipped away at the wall for souvenirs, the wall came down in earnest when excavators were brought in to officially bring the wall to its highly anticipated end. George H.W. Bush. Born in 1924 Milton, Massachusetts, the son of Senator Prescott Bush, George H.W. Bush attended the elite Phillips Academy in Andover until Japan's unprovoked attack on American naval assets at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Enlisting into the Navy on his 18th birthday, Bush became the youngest naval fighter pilot during World War II, flying 58 combat missions, including a September 2, 1944 bombing run over the Japanese island of Shishijima, when his TBM Avenger was shot down by enemy aircraft fire. The only survivor of 3 aviators, Bush floated in the Pacific Ocean for 4 hours until he was rescued by the USS Finback, a Gato-class submarine. Marrying his prep school sweetheart Barbara Pierce in January of 1945, Bush graduated from Yale with an economics degree before starting an oil and gas exploration company in 1953, which ultimately made him a wealthy man. Elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1966, Bush would later be appointed as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, headed the Republican National Committee during the Watergate Scandal, U.S. envoy to China, and director of the CIA, before running for president in 1980. Losing his party's nomination, Bush became the 2-term vice president under Ronald Reagan's presidency from 1981 to 1989, winning the White House during the election cycle of 1988 against Democratic candidate Michael Dukakis. During his 1-term presidency, Bush skillfully handled complex foreign affairs, including the fall of the Berlin Wall and the removal of Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega from power. When Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait on August 2, 1990, Bush's swift response during 2 offensives known as Desert Shield and Desert Storm gave him one of the highest approval ratings in American presidential history. Losing to Bill Clinton in the presidential election cycle of 1992 due to a failing economy and perceptions that he was out of touch with average Americans, Bush remained active in retirement until his death on November 30th, 2018, leaving behind a legacy example of patriotism and leadership.